It took me a long time to understand what was meant in the Old Testament by sacrifice, and which is strange because once I figured it out, it seemed bloody obvious. It seemed like, oh yeah, obviously that's what it means. But lots of times, if you figure something out correctly, it seems self-evident as soon as you figured it out correctly. Well, we'll see how that goes, but you know, it seemed to work for me anyways. I knew that, of course, at least implicitly, I knew of the modern usage of the idea of sacrifice. Everyone understands that motif, is that if you want to make things better in the future, then you make sacrifices in the present. And maybe you even do that multi-generationally. In fact, you most definitely do if you're a good parent. I mean, and that's, I would say that's really particularly typical of immigrants, right? Because immigrants often come from terrible places and have to undergo terrible things to come to a new community where they get a rough reception and have a hard time getting their life going. And a big part of the reason that they do it is to make their lives of their children better. And luckily, when they come to Canada, usually given where they came from, that actually works because where they came from is worse and here is better, even though immigrants often have to struggle to get on their feet again. They have to learn a new language and become enculturated and face the fact that they're not part of the mainstream culture. And well, many of you know the whole story. So the idea that you make sacrifices for the future and you make sacrifices for your children, and everyone understands that, and it's part of being responsible and mature and shouldering the burden of being properly. And you do that for yourself too. If you're disciplined, in fact, that's almost what discipline means. Discipline means that you're capable of making sacrifices, because you're not disciplined if you just do something you want more rather than something that you're doing. That's not discipline. Maybe that works and great. If your life is working out that way, great, man, but that isn't discipline. Discipline is when you want to do something right now, and instead you think, no, I'm going to forestall my gratification, maybe forever, but certainly for a very long period of time, medium to long period of time, and you concentrate on something that you think will bear fruit in the medium to long run. And so you look into the future and you decide that by making today a little less impulsively pleasurable, shall we say, you'll make tomorrow a little bit more secure and productive. And then you actually do it too. And that's difficult, and we discussed last week Adam and Eve's discovery of the future and the revelation of the possibility of the future, including the possibility of tragedy and suffering in the future. And it's our knowledge of the possibility of tragedy and suffering in the future that motivates us to sacrifice in the present so that we can reduce the unnecessary anxiety and uncertainty and pain that awaits us. Now, that's a negative way of putting it. We're also doing it so that, we can have some joy and we can make life better and all of that, and that's not trivial. But the fundamental issue, especially once you have small children, this fundamental issue is to stave the suffering, the hell off, right? That's what you want to do. That's your primary moral obligation if you're a person who has if your eyes are open at all, that's your primary obligation. And so you make the sacrifices that are necessary and you set up the future. And well, the motif of sacrifice is there in the Old Testament, but it's so concrete that it's difficult to draw a parallel between the two. At least for me, they didn't align self-evidently. And I don't remember in my rather limited religious education as a child in the United Church, because I went to the United Church till I was about 13. I don't ever remember anybody pointing out that, like, the sacrifices that Cain and Abel were making, or the sacrifice that Abraham was supposed to make, or the sacrifices that people were making to God were the precursors, let's say, the dramatic precursors to the psychological idea of sacrifice that we all hold as civilized people in the modern world. So, although it seems obvious, as I said, once you lay it out, I don't remember that ever being explained to me. And then let me read this. So now that I've sort of introduced it, here's what happened as humanity developed. First were the endless tens or hundreds of thousands of years prior to the emergence of written history and drama. The twin practices of delay and exchange began to emerge slowly and painfully. So here's a cool psychological study. So it's called the marshmallow test. And maybe it's even a reliable study, even though it was done by social psychologists. It's probably replicable. And it's a nice study. So you take small children and you bring them into a room and you put something that they would like in front of them, a marshmallow, and then you torture them. Basically, you say, "See that marshmallow?" And the kid thinks, yeah, man, I see that marshmallow. It's like, you can have that marshmallow right now. Or if you wait, I think the experiment is 10 minutes, then you can have 2 marshmallows. And so that puts the child in quite a conundrum, because they're being asked to trade an actual, concrete, tangible marshmallow for 2 hypothetical future marshmallows. And it's not that easy to conjure up a hypothetical future reality that has the same tangible significance as something real right in front of you. And so it's an amazing thing that people can do that. And so then the experimenter leaves, and some children grab the marshmallow and just, chomp that thing down right now. Other kids, they videotape kids while they're waiting, and they do all sorts of things. They whistle, they look at the ceiling, they sit on their hands, they try to distract themselves. Of course, they're eyeing that marshmallow like a squirrel eyeing a nut, and trying to restrain themselves. And what I see in that is that the child's prefrontal cortex, the higher cortical systems, are warring with the underlying motivational systems, more primordial motivational systems that govern such things as hunger. The hunger system, hypothalamic system, says there's something sweet and fat right sitting there, right bloody now. Grab that thing and stuff it down now. And I'm sure many of you have a constant battle with your hypothalamus with regards to sweet and fat things, and often lose. So you can feel some sympathy for the child. And the hypothalamus has these tremendously powerful tendrils upward into the brain, into the parts that we would associate more with voluntary control. And the voluntary control centers have these little weak ribbons going down to control the hypothalamus. It's pretty obvious, if you know something about neuroanatomy, what part is actually in charge when the chips are down. And it's not easy for children to learn to regulate those underlying primordial impulses, the ones that are wired in, the ones that we share with animals, but they do it. And the cool thing is, this is what Walter Mischel found, he's the guy who did the study, was that the long-term outcome for the children who can delay gratification in the marshmallow test is much more positive than it is for the children that are impulsive and eat the marshmallow instantly. It's delay of gratification. Now, it's likely that that's associated with trait conscientiousness, although that specific connection has not yet been established, but they seem conceptually very, very similar. So anyways, this emerges in children probably between the ages of 2 and 4, something like that. They should have it in place by 4, because it's very difficult for them to really interact well with other children without having that delay of gratification in place. Because if you can't delay gratification, other kids don't like you, because you want everything your way and you want it now, and you're liable to temper tantrums and that sort of thing. You haven't got the kind of self-control necessary to make you fun to play with. So you can see that emerging in children, and it's pretty interesting. And not only that, if it emerges, it predicts positive long-term outcomes, just like trait conscientiousness does, by the way, because trait conscientiousness is the second best predictor of long-term success over the lifespan. In Western cultures, it's second after intelligence. And so in our societies, the people who do best across time are the people who have high IQs and who work hard. And I would say that's a pretty decent, what would you call it? It's a validation in some sense that our cultures are working properly, because what you would want, I would say, if the system is working meritocratically like it should, and if you're trying to extract resources from those who can contribute at a higher rate, then what you would want to have happen is that the hardworking, smart people do better. Hopefully, if that's the case, then everyone does better. Hopefully. Anyways, so you can see this developing in children. First were the endless tens or hundreds of thousands of years prior to the emergence of written history and drama, the twin practices of delay and exchange. began to emerge slowly and painfully. Then they became represented in metaphorical abstraction as rituals and tales of sacrifice. It's as if there's a powerful figure in the sky who's judging you. You better keep him happy or look the hell out. We've been watching ourselves deal with him for a long time. He seems to like it when you give up something you value. So practice sharing and sacrificing until you get good at it. No one actually said any of this so long ago, although they said something very similar. But it was implicit in the practice and then in the stories. Action comes first. Implicit comes first. People watched the successful succeed and the unsuccessful fail for thousands and thousands of years, and we thought it over and we drew a conclusion. The successful among us sacrifice. The successful among us delay gratification. The successful among us bargain with the future. And then a great idea begins to emerge in ever more articulated form. That idea is the point of a long and profound story. It's the moral of the story. And I'm going to engage in some foreshadowing here. What's the difference between the successful and the unsuccessful? The successful sacrifice, and things get better as the successful practice their sacrifices. The question becomes increasingly precise and simultaneously broader. What is the greatest possible sacrifice for the greatest possible good? You know, if you push a question in a direction, perhaps there comes a time when you can't formulate it any more precisely and broadly, and that's the point at which the question, in some sense, and perhaps even the answer, the question becomes archetypal. It becomes archetypal because it can't be bested. And this is like an ultimate question in some sense. How are you going to ask a more broad-based question than that? What is, given the initial presuppositions that you have to make sacrifices, then the logical endpoint to that is something like, okay, if you have to make a sacrifice, what's the greatest possible sacrifice and for the greatest possible good? That's a good question. The answer becomes increasingly profound. The God of Western tradition, like so many gods, requires sacrifice. We've already examined why, but sometimes he goes even further and requires the sacrifice of what is loved best. This is why. And this is another one of mankind's fundamental discoveries. Sometimes things do not go well. That's self-evident. But here's the rub. Sometimes when things are not going well, it's precisely that which is most valued that is the cause.